All right, today we're tackling a really tough topic, one that's sensitive and, let's be honest, often misunderstood. We're going to look at the history of female captives, known as kaneez, in early Islam. And it's one that, brings up some really difficult questions. So to find the real answers, we have to go back to the beginning.
So let's just jump right in. What are the big questions here? Did the Quran actually permit the enslavement of women during wartime? And what was the reality on the ground for women during those early conquests in places like Persia?
Okay, to really get this, we've got to put on our historian hats. It means we can't judge the 7th century by 21st century standards. We have to look at the world as it actually was back then. The norms, the laws, and the often brutal realities of that time. You see, this wasn't something that just appeared out of nowhere. Long before Islam, taking female captives was a deeply rooted global practice. I mean, look at this. 4,000 years ago, the Code of Hammurabi was already laying down rules for it. Fast forward to 2,500 years ago, and Persian kings are taking war captives as concubines. By the time of the Sassanians, rulers like Khusro Parvis reportedly had thousands of kaneez. This was the global standard.
And this is maybe the most crucial point to grasp. Islam didn't create the system of kaneez. It was born into a world where this was a universal fact of war and life. So its approach wasn't to invent something new, but to engage with what was already there and to regulate it, to reform it. It took an existing system and started changing the rules in a fundamental way.
And wow, when you put them side by side, the contrast is just stark. The prevailing norm across the globe was pretty grim. Women treated as property, forced prostitution was common, and there was basically no hope of freedom for them or their children. But then the Islamic reforms came in and introduced a defined legal status, strictly forbade prostitution, and created not one but multiple paths to freedom. And this is huge. It decreed that any child born to a kaneez was born free and could inherit from their father.
Okay, so this verse right here, this is the one that gets a lot of attention in modern discussions. It addresses the status of married women captured in war. And yeah, reading it today, it can be really shocking. So let's break down exactly what it meant and, just as importantly, under which very specific conditions it applied.
The first thing to understand is that this wasn't some kind of blanket permission, not at all. Jurists laid out these 5 super strict conditions that all had to be met. The woman had to be a non-Muslim, part of an enemy army, captured in the heat of battle, and her husband couldn't be captured with her. This was a rule for the specific and pretty desperate circumstances of war.
So you might be asking, why? Why would a rule like this even exist? Well, you have to think about the absolute chaos of ancient warfare. Women captured from a defeated army were essentially stateless, with no one to protect them, and were vulnerable to abuse from literally anyone. This framework, as difficult as it is to view now, assigned a single person legal responsibility for her protection, her food, her shelter, basically bringing her into a family structure instead of leaving her completely abandoned.
Okay, so we've talked about the rules in the scripture, but that's one thing. What about the personal example? To really get the spirit of these laws, we have to look at how the Prophet Muhammad himself actually interacted with women who are captured in war.
A perfect example is the story of Juwairiya. Now, she was a woman of high status, a noble woman whose tribe was just defeated in battle. As a captive, her future looked pretty bleak.
But instead of her story ending there, the Prophet steps in. He pays for her freedom himself, immediately frees her, and then he proposes marriage. And get this, her dowry wasn't gold or silver. It was the freedom of 40 of her own captured kinsmen.
And this one act had this incredible ripple effect. His soldiers saw this and were like, wait a minute, how can we possibly enslave the in-laws of the Prophet? And just like that, they freed everyone else from her tribe. A moment of conquest turned into this amazing act of mass liberation and family building.
And this wasn't a one-off. It highlights a really key principle here: choice. Take the story of Safiya, another noble woman captured in battle. Even in that situation, she was given complete agency over her own future. The Prophet told her she could keep her religion and go free, no strings attached, or she could choose to marry him. The choice was entirely hers.
All right, so that's the ideal, right? That's the prophetic model. But then there's the messy reality of what happens when armies and empires start expanding. And that brings us to the gap between the ideal and the reality.
And historical sources from the conquest of Persia show us this really clear fork in the road. A city's fate basically came down to one thing:
Did they fight or did they surrender peacefully? For cities that fought back hard, like Kazakhstan, defeat often meant their people were enslaved. But for cities like Isfahan that negotiated a peaceful surrender, the outcome was totally different.
And this is such a crucial detail. Those peace treaties weren't just vague promises. They specifically, explicitly protected women and children from being taken as kaneezas. This shows there was a very clear legal line drawn between how non-combatants in a surrendered city were treated versus active combatants on a battlefield.
But look, let's be real. History is messy, and the actions of armies on the ground, well, they didn't always match the prophetic ideal. The motivations of soldiers and commanders were often power, expansion, and wealth, not always piety. And that gap, that's a sad truth we see in every empire, in every era of human history.
So when all is said and done, what was the biggest, most lasting legacy of these reforms? Well, it led to nothing short of a revolution in social status.
And this might be the most radical change of all. In a world where having a slave in your ancestry was a deep source of shame, Islam completely flipped that on its head. Just look at the mothers of several of the most revered figures in Shia Islam, men cherished by millions. These incredible women, Hamada, Najma, Narjis, had once been kaneez.
Think about what that means. This completely tore up the old social rulebook. It shattered those rigid class structures that had dominated the ancient world for centuries. It made it possible for a woman who came from what was considered the lowest social rung to become the mother of the community's most respected spiritual leader. Her past didn't define her worth.
And that kind of leaves us with one final, pretty heavy thought to chew on. When we look back at this history and we're horrified by the brutality, are we really judging a single religion? Or are we just seeing the ugly, timeless truth about war itself, that it seems to give humans permission to be animals? A sad fact of history that knows no single people or faith.